Dr. James Morrison was only 24 years old. Across from him lay General Sullivan, a 30-year veteran of war. One was a fresh graduate from medical school, the other a legendary commander. But that night, the young doctor would have to do what 30 years of experience couldn't: save the general's life. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we continue with this incredible true story, tell us in the comments which city around the world you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I genuinely thank you for being part of it. The assignment Fort Bragg Medical Center had seen its share of high-ranking patients. But when General Robert Sullivan was admitted on that cold November evening, the entire atmosphere shifted. The 54-year-old general was a living legend in military circles. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Medal of Honor from his service in Iraq and Afghanistan. His reputation preceded him like a shadow cast by decades of distinguished service. Dr. James Morrison adjusted his white coat nervously as he walked down the corridor toward the VIP wing. At 24, he was the youngest doctor on staff, barely 2 years out of Johns Hopkins Medical School. His residency at the military hospital was supposed to be routine, treating soldiers for common ailments, handling minor injuries, maybe assisting in a few surgeries. What he wasn't prepared for was being assigned as the attending physician for one of the most decorated generals in the US Army. The assignment had come directly from Colonel Harris, the chief medical officer. "Morrison," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of military protocol. "General Sullivan specifically requested a young doctor. Says he doesn't want some old-timer treating him like he's fragile." "You're up." James had nodded, trying to hide his nervousness behind professional composure. But inside, his mind was racing. Why would a general with Sullivan's stature request a rookie doctor? It didn't make sense, and in James's short medical career, he'd learned that things that didn't make sense usually meant trouble. The first encounter General Sullivan's room was at the end of the VIP wing, flanked by 2 military police officers who nodded respectfully as James approached. He knocked softly before entering, his hands slightly trembling as he gripped his medical bag. The general was sitting up in bed, reading what appeared to be a military briefing. Even in a hospital gown, he commanded presence. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his posture straight despite being hospitalized. When he looked up, his piercing blue eyes seemed to assess James in a single glance. "You must be Dr. Morrison," Sullivan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "You look even younger than I expected." "Yes, sir," James replied, setting his bag down carefully. "I'm here for your examination, General. How are you feeling today?" Sullivan chuckled, but there was something hollow in the sound. "Doctor, I've been shot at, bombed, and have lived through more firefights than I care to count. A little chest pain isn't going to slow me down." But James noticed something the general's commanding presence couldn't hide. The slight wince when he laughed, the way he favored his left side, the barely perceptible shortness of breath. These weren't symptoms to dismiss lightly, especially not in a man of Sullivan's age and military history. "With respect, General, chest pain in someone with your service record needs thorough evaluation. When did the symptoms start?" Sullivan's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "About 2 weeks ago. Nothing serious, just some discomfort during physical training. I figured it was time to get it checked out before my next deployment." James began his examination, starting with vitals. Blood pressure slightly elevated, heart rate irregular. As he moved the stethoscope across Sullivan's chest, he heard something that made him pause. A faint murmur, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. "General, I need to ask about your medical history. Any previous heart conditions? Injuries to the chest area?" "Clean bill of health, doctor. Always has been." But something in Sullivan's eyes suggested that wasn't the complete truth. James had learned to read patients during his residency, and the general, for all his commanding presence, was holding something back. "The discovery, I'd like to run some tests," James said, making notes in Sullivan's chart. "An EKG, chest X-ray, and some blood work. Just to be thorough." Sullivan nodded, but James caught another wince as the general shifted position. "Whatever you think is necessary, document. But make it quick. I've got a briefing with Pentagon officials tomorrow." The tests were scheduled for that afternoon. James tried to focus on his other patients, but his mind kept returning to General Sullivan. There was something about the man's presentation that didn't add up. The way he downplayed his symptoms, the guarded responses to questions about his medical history, the subtle signs of pain he was trying to hide. When the test results came back 3 hours later, James stared at the chest X-ray in disbelief. There, clearly visible in the upper left quadrant of Sullivan's chest, was a foreign object, metallic, roughly the size of a quarter, lodged dangerously close to the heart, that he immediately pulled up Sullivan's military medical records, searching for any mention of previous injuries. What he found made his blood run cold. 15 years earlier, during a firefight in Fallujah, Sullivan had been wounded by shrapnel from an IED explosion. The field medics had removed most of the fragments, but one piece had been deemed too close to vital organs to safely extract, and was left in place, with regular monitoring recommended. But according to the records, Sullivan had never followed up on the monitoring. The fragment had been forgotten, filed away in military bureaucracy, and now, 15 years later, it had shifted position. The metal piece was now pressing against the pericardium, the protective sac around the heart. One wrong movement, one strong impact, and it could puncture the heart wall. James felt his hands shake as he held the X-ray up to the light. This wasn't just chest pain. This was a ticking time bomb in the general's chest. And based on the irregular heartbeat and other symptoms, the fragment was already affecting cardiac function. The confrontation James walked back to Sullivan's room with heavy steps. How do you tell a decorated war hero that he's been walking around with a potentially fatal condition for 15 years? How do you explain to a man who survived multiple combat deployments that a piece of forgotten shrapnel might be what finally kills him? He knocked and entered to find Sullivan exactly as he'd left him, reading briefings, maintaining the image of a healthy, active military leader. "General, we need to talk about your test results." Sullivan looked up, and James saw something flicker in his eyes. Not surprise, but resignation. "You found it, didn't you?" The admission hung in the air between them. James sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. "You knew about the shrapnel." "Of course I knew," Sullivan said quietly. 15 years ago, some kid medic, who wasn't much older than you, told me it was too dangerous to remove. Said I should get regular checkups, monitor it carefully. But you know how it is, document wars don't wait for medical appointments. "General, this fragment has moved. It's now in a critical position near your heart. The symptoms you're experiencing, the chest pain, the irregular heartbeat, they're all connected to this." Sullivan nodded slowly. "How bad is it?" James took a deep breath. "Without surgery, you're looking at a high probability of cardiac tamponade, blood filling the space around your heart. It could happen tomorrow, next week, or next month. But it's not a question of if, General. It's a question of when. And with surgery, it's complicated. The fragment is in a very delicate position. It would require open-heart surgery, and even then, there are significant risks. But it's your best chance." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the base parade ground where young soldiers were conducting evening drills. "Doctor, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How old are you, exactly?" 24, sir." 24, Sullivan repeated. "When I was your age, I was a second lieutenant leading my first platoon in Kosovo. Thought I knew everything there was to know about leadership, about life, about what it meant to serve. I was wrong about most of it." James waited, sensing that the general was working through something important. "You know what I learned after 30 years of service, Dr. Morrison? That the hardest battles aren't fought with enemies you can see. They're fought with the consequences of decisions you made years ago, choices that seemed right at the time, but come back to haunt you. General, this isn't about choices you made. You were wounded in service to your country. The medical decisions made then were based on the best information available." Sullivan smiled sadly. "That's generous of you, document. But the truth is, I made a choice 15 years ago. I chose to ignore the follow-up appointments, chose to pretend that piece of metal wasn't there, chose to keep deploying, because I thought the mission was more important than my health. The weight of command. There's something else you need to know," Sullivan continued. "I'm not just any general. I'm currently overseeing Operation Desert Shield 2, a classified mission that's set to launch in 3 weeks. 30,000 troops are depending on the strategies I've developed. If word gets out that I'm having heart surgery, it could jeopardize the entire operation." James felt the weight of the revelation. This wasn't just about one patient anymore. It was about national security, about thousands of lives that could be affected by the general's health status. "Sir, with all due respect, none of that matters if you're dead. You can't command anything from a grave. And I can't command anything from a hospital bed for 6 months of recovery, either," Sullivan countered. "Dr. Morrison, I need you to understand something. I've spent my entire adult life putting the mission first, putting other people's lives ahead of my own. It's not just what I do, it's who I am. James leaned forward in his chair. General, I understand the weight of command, I really do. But I took an oath as a doctor to first do no harm. If I let you walk out of here knowing what I know, I'd be violating everything I believe in as a physician. And if I don't walk out of here, 30,000 soldiers could be going into battle with compromised leadership. How many lives is that worth, Doctor? The ethical dilemma was staggering. James had never faced anything like this in medical school. The textbooks didn't cover what to do when your patient's life was secondary to national security concerns. The decision that night, James couldn't sleep. He walked the hospital corridors, thinking about the impossible situation he found himself in. On one hand, he had a patient with a life-threatening condition who needed immediate surgery. On the other hand, that patient was responsible for a classified military operation that could affect thousands of lives. He thought about his medical training, about the Hippocratic Oath he'd taken just 2 years ago. But he also thought about his own military service, about the oath he'd taken when he joined the Army Medical Corps to serve his country. At 3 a.m., he found himself back in Sullivan's room. The general was awake, staring at the ceiling. Couldn't sleep either? Sullivan asked. No, sir. I keep thinking about what you said. And James pulled up a chair. General, can I tell you why I became a military doctor? Sullivan nodded. My older brother was killed in Afghanistan 5 years ago. He was a Marine, 22 years old. He died because the medic who tried to save him didn't have enough experience, didn't recognize the signs of internal bleeding in time. I swore that day that I would become the kind of doctor who could save soldiers like my brother. I'm sorry for your loss, Dr. Morrison. Thank you, sir. But here's the thing. My brother died serving his country, following orders from commanders like you. He trusted that his leaders would make decisions that gave him the best chance of survival. Right now, I'm asking you to make a decision that gives you the best chance of survival. Sullivan was quiet for several minutes. You're asking me to choose between my life and my duty. No, sir. I'm asking you to understand that your life is your duty. Those 30,000 soldiers need a healthy commander, not a dead hero. They need someone who can think clearly, make split-second decisions, and lead them through whatever they're going to face. You can't do any of that with a piece of shrapnel next to your heart. The surgery the next morning, James found himself in the unusual position of briefing the Pentagon about General Sullivan's condition. The call came at 6 a.m. 3 officials, including the Secretary of Defense, wanted a full medical assessment. Dr. Morrison, came the voice through the secure phone line. We understand General Sullivan requires surgery. What's the timeline for his recovery? Sir, if the surgery goes well, we're looking at a minimum of 8 weeks for initial recovery, followed by several months of limited duty. But without the surgery, the general could suffer cardiac arrest at any time. There was a long pause. Doctor, Operation Desert Shield 2 is critical to national security. Is there any way to delay the surgery for 1 month? James felt his stomach clench. Sir, with all due respect, delaying surgery significantly increases the risk of sudden death. I cannot, in good conscience, recommend that course of action. We'll get back to you, Doctor. When James hung up, he realized he was sweating. In his short military career, he'd never directly contradicted Pentagon officials, but he'd just put his patient's welfare ahead of military operations. An hour later, Sullivan was informed that a replacement commander would be brought in to oversee Operation Desert Shield 2. The surgery was scheduled for that afternoon. They wheeled Sullivan into the operating room. He grabbed James's hand. Doctor, I want you to know something. In 30 years of service, I've worked with hundreds of officers, soldiers, and support staff. Very few of them had the courage to tell a general he was wrong. You've got the makings of a fine military officer. Thank you, sir. I'll see you after the surgery. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief cardiac surgeon, led the operation while James assisted. It was the most complex procedure he'd ever been involved in. The shrapnel was embedded so close to the heart that even the slightest mistake could be fatal. There it is, Dr. Williams said, pointing to the metallic fragment visible through the surgical opening. 15 years of sitting there, slowly migrating toward the heart wall. Another few weeks, and this would have been a very different conversation. The extraction required precision that James had only read about in medical journals. Using a combination of microsurgical techniques and cardiac bypass support, Dr. Williams slowly worked the fragment free from the surrounding tissue. Got it, she announced, holding up the piece of shrapnel. A jagged piece of metal about the size of a quarter, stained with 15 years of body tissue. This little piece of a rock has been on quite a journey. James stared at the fragment, realizing how close they'd come to losing Sullivan. If the general had waited even another month, if he'd gone on that deployment, the physical stress could have been fatal. Sullivan's recovery was slower than expected. The combination of his age and the complexity of the surgery meant weeks of careful monitoring. James visited daily, tracking the general's progress and gradually watching him transform from a patient back into the commanding officer he'd always been. "You know, Doctor," Sullivan said during one of their sessions, "I've been thinking about what you said about duty and survival." "What about it, sir?" "I spent so many years thinking that duty meant sacrifice, that being a good soldier meant being willing to die for the mission. But you taught me something important. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is choose to live, choose to take care of yourself, so you can take care of others." James nodded. "How do you feel about missing the operation?" Sullivan smiled. "The replacement commander did an excellent job. Mission accomplished, 0 casualties. Turns out the Pentagon could function without me for a few months." "Imagine that," James said with a smile. "Dr. Morrison, I have a confession. Do you want to know why I specifically requested a young doctor? I've been wondering about that. Because I knew an older, more experienced physician would have immediately recognized the symptoms and forced me into surgery. I thought a young doctor might be easier to convince, might let me delay treatment until after the operation." James stared at him. "You were trying to manipulate me?" "I was trying to manipulate you, but you had something I didn't expect." "Which was?" "Integrity. You put my health ahead of everything else, my rank, my mission, even pressure from the Pentagon. That takes courage, Doctor. More courage than I showed for 15 years. The lesson 6 months later, James received orders for his next assignment. Chief Medical Officer for a forward operating base in Eastern Europe. It was a significant promotion, especially for someone his age. The night before his departure, General Sullivan, now fully recovered and back to active duty, stopped by James's office. "I wanted to give you something," Sullivan said, handing James a small wooden box. Inside was the piece of shrapnel that had been removed from Sullivan's chest, now mounted on a small plaque with an inscription. "To Dr. James Morrison, courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's charging into battle. Sometimes it's telling a general he needs surgery. Thank you for saving my life. General Robert Sullivan." "I don't know what to say, sir." "Don't say anything. Just remember that in your career, you're going to face situations where doing the right thing isn't the easy thing. When that happens, think about this moment. Think about the choice between what's convenient and what's right." Sullivan paused at the door. "One more thing, Doctor. That operation I missed? The one that was so critical to national security." "Yes, sir. It was a routine training exercise. Important, yes, but not nearly as critical as I made it sound. I was using it as an excuse to avoid surgery, and you saw right through it. That's what makes you a good doctor, James. You never lost sight of what really mattered." Epilogue Dr. James Morrison went on to serve with distinction in multiple combat zones, saving hundreds of lives over his military career. He eventually became one of the Army's youngest chief medical officers, known for his combination of clinical excellence and unwavering ethical standards. General Robert Sullivan continued his military service for 5 more years before retiring. He often spoke at military academies about leadership, always including the story of the young doctor who had the courage to challenge a general. The lesson both men learned that day stayed with them throughout their careers. That true courage isn't just about facing external enemies. It's about having the strength to do what's right, even when everything else tells you to do what's easy. And sometimes, the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in hospital rooms. Between duty and self-preservation, between rank and integrity, between a 24-year-old doctor and a 30-year veteran, who both had to learn that saving lives sometimes means saving yourself first. In the end, experience matters, but it's not everything. Sometimes wisdom comes from youth, courage comes from inexperience, and the right decision comes from someone young enough to believe that doing the right thing is always possible, no matter who's giving the orders. Years later, when James became a general himself, he always made sure his medical staff knew Vithi had not just the authority, but the obligation to prioritize health over politics, life over mission, and patience over protocol, because he learned from a 54-year-old general who almost died from stubbornness that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is trust a doctor, even if that doctor is young enough to be their son.